Hey all, welcome back to Mike Reads the World. In my last video I received a comment suggesting that I should do a video about all of my favorite books, as many times I have mentioned that I have sort of a group of favorite books, and I always throw out a different number because I've never actually sat down and brought them all together to look at them. So what you saw in the opening pan, I suppose, is, most simply put, my favorite books. But it really isn't that simple, because as I sat down to do this, well, I didn't sit down, I stood up at my bookshelf looking, but actually it was very, very little looking through the bookshelf. Actually, first I started by writing down just the ones that came to mind, right? And then I thought, okay, there's got to be a few gaps in here, so I went to the bookshelf and I was looking, okay, what has really stood out? What's been different? And I started with a solid core of about 20 books, but then started realizing that favorite book has a number of meanings, doesn't it? There's books that sustained my literary journey to the point where one day I decided to try to read a book from every different country, which has led me indirectly to discovering so many great things. There are the books that I've tried to start many times, but haven't finished or haven't even gotten halfway through them, but I'm so fascinated by them that I keep returning to them and keep wanting to try to read them. So all of that type of book is here, but I essentially, and I took a few out, but basically I had to ask myself a few questions. And if I said yes to each one, the book stayed. Did it make a powerful impression? Would I want to read it again? Or another way you can phrase that question, is it a world I can return to? Okay? And finally, did it change how I view literature and or life? So there are these books, and then there's also the books that I have, tried to start and I'm actually reading right now that, my taste has actually been developed, I think, to a point through this project where even in the first third of a book, I can already tell you if it's going to be one of my favorite books of all time. And this is kind of related to another theme that we'll discover as I'm discussing these books, is that I don't really read for story. That is definitely going to be a theme here. I read for a world. And I don't mean necessarily a fictitious world. It can be, but this, an author, when they write something, whether it be succinct or long, is building a construct of ideas, of experiences, of people they've met in their life, of potentialities, of all sorts of different things. They're building this psychological construct that you as the reader engage with one-on-one, and then you engage with others, or sometimes you engage with others beforehand to learn about the book. And so there's this whole conversation that also adds to that construct, but at the core of it you have this construct, which is the book. And so it's not the story that interests me, that keeps me fascinated with a book, that keeps me returning to it. It's that interplay of many aspects of life that the author has put into this sort of object, and it's something that lives in my mind, a place that lives in my mind, a mental world that lives in my mind. I'm talking through this, trying to find the words to how to describe this, but perhaps, I've said it well, and I'll just start going through the books. But I realized very early on, and in that pan, up to Kafka, in the early pan of this video, up to Kafka, there is no book that I read for this Read Around the World project specifically. There are a few that appeared, but it was because I just wanted to talk about them. But I'd read those long before. So in that initial pan, after Kafka, all the way up to Ovid's Metamorphoses, those are the books that I actually read during the Read Around the World project, and many of them were kind of byproducts, like an additional book that I read for that country, or a book that had been mentioned many times in other literature, so I was curious to read that one too. And then it turned out to be one of the greatest things. So certainly with this Read Around the World project, if I had just gone down the list saying, okay, I'm only reading one book for every country, and not allowed myself to take detours, to revisit authors I'd already read and loved, to to read multiple books for the same country or by the same author, many of these books would not be appearing here, and I would not have found what are now some of my favorite books. So I think it's very, when I look back, it was not, I do not feel bad because it was not checklist reading. I really did kind of allow myself a lot of freedom within that structure, and can look back on that now without regrets. But this is what came out of it. And I want to start with, of course, when I was younger, I read Tolkien and C.S. Lewis and Philip Pullman was one that really was transformative in my thinking as a young person. And then as I got in high school, I started leaning toward nonfiction, history, some Buddhist philosophy I was getting into, but then I got really into music and kind of started leaving literature behind. And I can't think of a single book that to me was a literary work that really transformed me until Gorman Gast. And that would have been when I was 22 years old, I think. So, at this point we're talking 12 years ago. So about 12 years ago I read Gorman Gast, and specifically Titus Groan and Gorman Gast, just not Titus alone. I never read that one, but those two works function as a story. And again, just this dark fantasy world. I remember I was living in a big city in a small apartment, or a house with a small bedroom in a house where I spent most of my time, and I was just kind of thinking, about a lot of things in life and what I wanted to do with my life. And this book was just something I entered into every night over the course of many days. And actually, I finished Titus Groan at that time, but didn't come back and read Gorman Gast until many years later. So again, I read Titus Groan, but it was a world I wanted to come back to, and Gorman Gast is still a place I would return. I have to remind myself not to go too in depth with any of these, because otherwise this video will be 10 hours long. So the other transformative books I think for me around that time were The Summer Book and The True Deceiver. I was briefly interested in literature for a time and thought about it wasn't exactly literature, but I thought I'm going to start making on YouTube these playlists of all of these talks and essays by people I've admired or their work at some point in my life. And so Philip Pullman was one of those, and he mentioned Tove Janssen's The Summer Book, I believe. And so that's how I read The Summer Book, and then I also picked up The True Deceiver, and I've gone back and forth between which is my favorite of these two for so long, so that's why they're both here. But again, I can't objectively say whether these are some of the greatest books ever written, but to me they're favorites because they, again, sustained that interest in literature at a time when I wasn't that interested in it. I just really, I didn't care really about literature, but I did enjoy reading, and I enjoyed, video game worlds, and I read a lot of nonfiction, actually. I was always reading nonfiction. For most of my, after kind of my fantasy phase when I was younger, I really just read nonfiction for the most part, apart from the books that I'm showing here, until about 2 years ago, So 2.5 years ago, we'll say, is when I started reading fiction again. And some of this stuff is even hard to classify as strictly fiction, but we'll get there. Julio Ramon Ribero. When I was living in Peru, this was an author. You can see how worn out this book is. It's cracked. The spine is cracked in the middle. This book taught me Spanish in 2016 and 2017, and this was the time too that my wife and I were really getting to know each other, and it's a lot of memories with this book. We would read these stories out loud to each other, and just some really great, this is my favorite short story writer of all time, and I haven't read too many, I'll be honest. So, Edgar Allan Poe was also one that was formative for me when I was younger, but like this, I still have not found a better short story writer than Julio Ramon Ribero, and it's a shame more of his stuff is not translated into English. You can get some compilations, but some of my favorites in here, like 3 Uprising stories, I know maybe one of them is translated into English, but the best of them, and it's really better to read all 3 together, Tres Historias Sublevantes, these are just incredible things. And Only for Smokers, or Smokers Only, is another one of the first stories, the first story I think I read by him, and it was just this like tormented story about his pleasure and the harm like smoking has caused him throughout his. It was almost like an essay, and Julio Ramon Ribero, if I'm not mistaken, did pass away from lung cancer, so it's also kind of a makes you think in that way too. But yeah, it's I can't get too far into any of these or we'll be here all night, right? So next, while I was in Peru, and I was in Peru for about 3.5 years, I also got into Ernesto Sabo, the Argentine author, and I have here his 3, novels, El Túnel, On Heroes and Tombs, I grabbed the English of that for some reason, and Abaddon el Exterminador. So The Tunnel, On Heroes and Tombs, and Angel of Darkness is the English translation, but I like Abaddon el Exterminador. So these books, wow. I read, even though they are pretty long books, I read On Heroes and Tombs and Abaddon like pretty much in 3 nights, like concurrently. I just did not stop reading, and it was a very transformative moment for me in many ways, and is really, I think, what Ernesto Sabo for me is the first time I felt like I really appreciated like some true deep literature in my life, and I was so enthralled by it, the mixture of just psychological things and history but there was something like just primal and from the soul about it, like when you're hearing or just reading something that came from just the most tormented parts of this person's consciousness. And so I don't know, Ernesto Sabo, all 3 of his books are worth reading. I've done videos on them. I gotta keep moving. At this time, I read Romance of the Three Kingdoms using the help of a podcast. These aren't books that I would necessarily like read again, but being my first foray into the literature of a completely different culture is the reason that I think of them in that time. It took me just literally like months and months to read, like 6 months, I think, to get through this with the help of a podcast. And but it was just so worth it. And at the end, I felt like I'd really experienced something, like a piece of history, not just a great story, but like a piece of history, a whole ancient world. And there's obviously mythical elements to Romance of the Three Kingdoms, just came to life for me reading this. And then when I came back to the United States, I read Moby Dick for the first time. So this is now jumping forward 2 years Yeah. So after Romance of the Three Kingdoms, I was in Peru working for a bit and didn't really read too much more in that time. But then 2 years later, back in the States, I'm reading Moby Dick for the first time and remember enjoying it because to me it was like a psychological horror. No, not that, a survival horror type of book where you have this monster, this looming threat. And very similar to how I realized that what I was looking for in video games, I really should have been looking for in literature. What I wanted to find in video games for so long, by playing video games that had in-depth stories and like some philosophical elements, what I was really looking for was literature. And the same thing in horror. When I've been interested in horror that to me is like kind of intelligent horror, right? Like folkloric horror films, or like the movie Seven, which would be like a thriller, is one I really liked at one point. So this kind of intelligent psychological horror, what I was really looking for was Moby Dick. and that's been a big part of this journey, is realizing like a lot of these sort of sensational, superficial, like these sensational things that we chase with elements of philosophy and depth, for some of us, at least speaking for myself, in American society, what we're really looking for is a true engagement that you can only really get from literature, an engagement with the past, with linking the past and the present, with psychological elements, with spiritual elements. It's like all that stuff we're looking for. It's really, literature is the best place to get it. And I'm not saying video games and films and all that are completely worthless and can't bring in some of these elements. I think just literature makes all those things better. And if you're not finding what you're looking for in those things, the place you should be looking is books, probably. So, The Plague by Camus, really memorable to me just because I read it right before the pandemic, and it was the same time about that I was reading Gene Wolfe's Book of the New Sun, and yeah, those two, The Plague, it's like the problem is every one of these books has a story behind it, right? Every one of these books has a story behind it. So The Plague was when my wife and I were in the visa process, and everything was getting shut down because of COVID, and we were separated. We were separated during the whole time of COVID, trying to get that worked out. And so that's why to me it was such a powerful read at that time, because there's a moment in the book where a main character has to make a choice, kind of whether to run away and be with his loved one, or to make the hard choice and stay and do what needs to be done. And so I really resonated with that, and it's something I'll never forget just because of the timing of when I read the book and the scenario, the situation. So, Book of the New Sun, Gene Wolfe. This book consumed me for just about the next 2 years. During COVID and during kind of the years after, before I started this project. And I was so obsessed with these two books. I listened to the audiobooks how many times? I listened to complete podcasts analyzing every little thing in the book. And as a far future science fantasy, I don't think it gets any better than this. In the science fiction or fantasy genre. Of course, my personal opinion, but it is for me the one book in that genre, in those genres to me, that really transcends it, and to me sits right up on my shelf with all of this other great literature, and I don't for a second think of it as something less. But Gene Wolfe, of course, would have said he prefers science fiction and fantasy to remain criminal genres, and so we won't hype him up in that sense too much. We don't want academic respectability. Kafka, the Metamorphoses by Kafka. I read about Christmas of 2022. And so that was right before pretty much I posted my first video, and it's in this complete stories. A lot of Kafka didn't really connect with me, but the Metamorphosis really did. I remember being so overwhelmed with just the emotional, just the empathy it made me feel for Gregor Samsa, and very few books have actually brought my emotions kind of out to that point, feeling for a certain character, like to where you could really feel it, you know? And I think at a certain point in the project, it got a little bit harder to just automatically feel things for characters in the books, because the artifice, when you read a lot in a really short period of time, the artifices of the things kind of start to be more apparent, and it's sometimes actually a little harder to get immersed if you don't give space between your reading, perhaps. Yeah, this might be an hour-long video, I don't know. The first book, the first story that really wowed me in the Read Around the World project was Mehmed My Hawk, a Turkish novel from the 1950s. It was a time when I had just left a previous job and kind of feeling kind of in a transition place, and had some experiences that I just really resonated with the story of Mehmed and kind of his. It was so strange because obviously it's a culture and a time that was so different. How could I possibly relate to that? And it was my first realization that if I can't be anachronistic, if I can't relate my present situation and see these works as distant mirrors of what I'm going through now, what is the point? You know, and so being able to connect with such a different character in such a different time and place, even though as the story goes on, he becomes more myth-like than an actual character. But then there were other side characters that had really, really intriguing conflicts, and it's a book that I don't know for certain if I'll ever read it again, but it definitely is one that stood out and was the first book in this project that really, really engrossed me, yeah. I think it was around number 11 or so, and another one I read right after it, which this one almost slipped through if it weren't for a recent comment I got about it. Flights by Olga Tukarczak actually is in this vignette style, and since I read it as only the 12th book, I don't think I fully appreciated all of the literary references that are actually in this. And I said at the time it's a book that it's a modern novel that feels like a classic. And just looking at it a bit now, I still stand by that. I still think this is absolutely a book worth reading again, that made a powerful impression, and it changed the way I viewed literature. And especially as it relates to the modern era. And whenever I think about like how can a book be relevant now, I think of this one. And so Flights by Olga Tukarczak is one that has many books later, though I'm still a little bit a question mark about it. One that is continuing to be something that I think about. So is it a favorite? How do I define a favorite book? I'm not sure. Does it belong with all these others? I'm not sure, but it's here, and so it is. Pedro Parro was the first book, I think around number 20 in my Read Around the World project, that really just knocked me out. Like I think I was very enthusiastic in that video, and I think it deserves it too. I have not reread it yet since, but it's certainly memorable for being like a book that just like overwhelmed my brain and like shifted something in me, and after that reading was different, and I can't really explain how. It's a magic spell. Pedro Parro is a magic spell. And then there's The Water Margin. All right, The Water Margin, which this is interesting because as another ancient, not ancient, I always say ancient, but it's a really not like 1400s, 1700s, you know, Chinese classic, and it's just the classic. It is for me the quintessential outlaw tale of the world. Okay, you've got like Mehmed My Hawk was an amazing story, but I honestly think that's more of an honorable mention. For me, the water margin is this, and this isn't even the complete story. And some of the fun is the fact that you can't actually get the complete story in a book in English. There's a podcast that will take you through the complete story. There are, you know, kind of descriptions online. There's a YouTube video, but this is only up to a certain point, and as just an entertaining, hilarious, brutal, shocking, lurid, just fantastical story of outlaws and how they kind of one by one all joined this immortal band of debaucherous, you know, heroes, mighty men who might actually be demons. Just a wild read. I would actually recommend The Water Margin before Romance of the Three Kingdoms for someone who wants to experience like older Chinese literature. So, but China will be back yet again later on. The Epic of Gilgamesh for being just mankind's oldest story, right? The oldest story, at least in the Western tradition. I don't know if there's anything in other traditions that could, you know, if we can even call it that, Mesopotamia, whatever. Epic of Gilgamesh is old, and it is like shockingly relatable, and reminds us that, you know, the eternal questions that we have about our existence and the meaning of it and what is beyond, it goes back as far as we can possibly remember. The Black Spider by Jeremias Gotthelf was just the most terrifying book I've ever read, and even I think Thomas Mann, actually, yeah, he's here on the back saying, "There is scarcely a work in world literature that I admire more." And I agree. It is, you know, it's almost incredible that this exists. It is written by a pastor, a Swiss pastor in the 1800s, but it is just the most, and it's supposed to be like a religious warning tale, right? But it is some of the darkest stuff I've ever read. It's very much condensed. It's a dense little book that you can probably read in 1 or 2 sittings, but it's one that's going to stay with you and you will not forget. Jose Maria Arguedas, Losrios Profundos. This is another one that I had read in Peru and reread for this project. The great Peruvian novel. Jose Maria Arguedas, El Sexto by him, which is not translated into English, was the first book I ever read in Spanish. But Los Rios Profundos is the book that's really moved me. I've read it twice now, and just some truly beautiful moments and heartbreaking moments in this work that haven't stirred emotions up in the same way in me in any other book. And I think a big part of why this is among my favorite books is just, you know, my experience of reading it in Peru, in the Peruvian Andes, and in sort of having all that around me, you know, and feeling all of that too. So this is where we're kind of there. This is kind of a story, right? I feel like about the last 10 books or so I showed, kind of the whole first part of the Reading the World project was kind of preparing me for something bigger. And The General of the Dead Army by Ismail Kadare, who recently passed away actually, but a very overlooked Albanian author. This was like the first book I think he published, and probably isn't even often considered his best, but this, out of the 2 books I read, this is the one that really kind of haunts me. And I think a lot of it is because I see myself in some ways in the general, who isn't, you know, he's definitely a very flawed character, and I talk a lot more about that in my video on that book. So yeah, now we get to Machado de Assis, currently the most viewed video on my channel is for the posthumous memoirs of Bras Cubas, which at the time of review I said was the most extraordinary thing I ever read, and that was true at the time. It is still one of my favorite books, but I like Quincas Borba just as much, and almost the reason I would want to read Posthumous Memoirs of Bras Cubas, and I've read it like 3 times since, you know, in the last 2 years, just because it's that good. But it's more of an immediate, like, I understand, like, it's a much easier book to like right away, but Quincas Borba makes you work a little bit more, and the ending is just as haunting, but it's much more mysterious. And for that reason, because Quincas Borba is a much more mysterious book and is told in a much more indirect way, I'm almost more fascinated even with that one. But Machado de Assis, these 2 books together, which for me in my mind function as the same thing, yeah, one of my favorite pair of books of all time. And so that leads us to another Brazilian, which I read shortly after, her Hour of the Star, and I've also read Near to the Wild Heart and Agua Viva, but my favorite is still The Passion According to G.H. The Passion According to G.H. was like a transcendent experience. I mean, I honestly felt like I got transported while reading this book, and it's like that taking place in a liminal space and kind of horror in broad daylight are the kind of phrases I remember from my review of it. And then Clarice Lispector, just to me, is just really an inspiration to, like, if you want to write just what you want to write, just write what you want to write, you know? And it doesn't have to make money. You don't have to be a published author, but just write. Just from the soul to the page, you know? And a lot of these authors will tell you that too. Ernesto Sabo, that is pretty much where he was coming from. I think a lot of these authors, even though some of them are published and have made something of a career of it, I don't think there's too many that are just, that have produced, like, you know, just book after book like it was a professional, like it was a job, you know? And it wasn't like, anyway, that's when I got to the Magic Mountain. And if you've been following my channel for any amount of time, you've probably heard this book mentioned. We'll be talking more about the Magic Mountain shortly. This is in my top 5 books of all time. I don't really feel the need to rank. None of this is a ranking, right? But just to give you some perspective of where this one's at, it is right now in my 5 most mind-consuming books I've ever read. So I would say another would be Gene Wolfe's Book of the New Sun, and the others will be coming. So here's my other edition of the Magic Mountain. Cormac McCarthy, I read Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy, which was great, but I still wouldn't have said, like, okay, this is, like, you know, one of my favorite books ever. But Stella Maris and the Passenger, his final pair of books that, again, function as one. And I have the British edition here. I actually decided to buy it because when I'd originally read it, I got it from the library, actually. But I thought these British colorful editions looked kind of cool. So anyway, they are books that, why are they some of my favorites? Just the engagement with sort of the crisis of kind of classical literature and conceptions of the world coming up against science, just shattering all of them, and what we know about physics, and then realizing just the limits of what we can know. And Alicia as a character is so, I struggle with her because she really gets under my skin, and if you're really reading, she will get under yours too, and is really kind of scary. It's really scary how reading some of the things she says can make you feel like, you know, it's almost like a cosmic horror kind of level of unimportance that I was feeling while reading it. But it's a book that I need to go back into and grapple with some of those things, because some of the philosophies in it I just found so, like, at my core terrifying to grapple with. And I'm not saying that it's a nihilist book in any way. I think we are meant to struggle with Alicia, and I think even Alicia has a certain redemptive quality to her, perhaps. Yeah, definitely. She definitely does. But there's a lot in it. I am definitely not done analyzing this book and thinking about it. There's nothing... I have to reread it before I can even begin to start to say intelligent things about it, honestly. My video about it is basically just me trying to cope with the intense ideas in it. So, yeah, The Nine Cloud Dream. This is a book that was written in the Koreas in, I believe, the 1700s. And there's sort of but it's actually takes place in China. The story takes place in China, but it's a very, this is a point where I read several of these books with my uncle. Posthumous Memoirs, Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain, and The Nine Cloud Dream, and he kind of brought to my attention, I have this type of novel that I seem to like above all other novels. And it's the novel that asks you to step outside the life and the book that you're actually reading in order to consider it as a whole. And so I feel that there's been this progressive, for me, loss of interest in your typical story type novel. You know, your hero's journey, or your typical, like, or in Mehmed My Hawk, you know, an outlaw struggles against this tyrannical village chieftain or something like that, and tries to like your typical Disney storylines or film story, you know what I'm saying, right? That kind of stuff is starting to just be, and it was a long time ago, but it's these books, these novels where they ask you to really examine life and what it means, what's important in life. The Nine Cloud Dream is about a man who basically, who's a monk, and then gets sent to hell, and then returned to Earth, possibly in a dream, to live out his greatest life, the greatest life anyone could imagine. He gets every achievement. He's the smartest, strongest, the most renowned man in the kingdom. He gets like 9 varied and beautiful women who are actually all really great characters too. So it's not all about this man, actually. But at the end of it, realizing, like, well, you can get all this and still be you can still be sad at the end of your life. You can still have missed the point, or feel that you've missed the point. And so it's really a book that I want to reread and always am reconsidering the implications of it and thinking about, there is just no point resenting the success or the power or the what others have, you know, what others achieve that you can't, because, well, you know, provided, all underscored by provided this isn't directly like hurting your life, right? But the point is, you don't know where someone's going to end up. You don't know if the success that they are achieving or that you perceive as greater than you is going to make them happy in the end. You don't know if they'll get to the end of their life having lived the life that you imagined to be the life of your dreams and feel fulfilled, or be like our main character here and asking what it was all for, and having to learn one last lesson. But the book is actually kind of a cozy read in a way, because it's not a sad ending, but it's a very wise ending, I think. So Don Quixote, of course, a great classic of world literature. Just reading this with my wife over the course of a year was really something, and that's been a theme that's recurring. Reading books with other people, like somebody else that's reading it at the same time with you, and being able to have discussions with them and feel the emotions together. I mean, both of us crying at the end. Oop, those are the books falling. Crying at the end of Don Quixote. Just really, some of it is kind of that experience of connection that you can have with others over a book is what makes a book your favorite of all time. I mean, a favorite of all time. And, let alone the fact that Don Quixote is important, not just to understanding, Spanish literature, but any country who speaks Spanish. This is probably one of the most read books. And so it is also, I think, essential to understanding most of, or not understanding, but appreciating a lot of Latin American literature. But again, I don't like to essentialize things. If you don't want to read Don Quixote, don't read Don Quixote. But it is really, I think, a more entertaining book if you get the right translation than you may be expecting. So, but speaking of entertaining, now, Candide by Voltaire, I think I expressed pretty well why this book kind of was important to me. It's the only book from the 18th century, Age of Enlightenment period that I've read, and it really kind of helps me understand, this point where humanity was kind of awakening to things, or at least gives that impression, right? This idea that, like, we should be better than what we are. And that is a very pervasive feeling in Candide. We should be better than what we are, and things won't get better unless we do our part, unless we cultivate our gardens. And so I got to read Candide again and probably do more research on different perspectives on it, but it was a very just entertaining and kind of funny, and again brutal, and again kind of just sort of sensationalist type of read, but I enjoyed it. So, wow, then we get to Naguib Mahfouz's Children of the Alley. Wow, what an exploration of the meaning of religion and the difficulty of being without it, just at the time that I needed it, and the way that it engages so fairly and beautifully with each religion, while also being an allegory and possibly not actually representing any of those religions at all. In the end, it's just a story. There's something really special about Children of the Alley by Naguib Mahfouz, and I haven't read any other books by him, but I want to. But I really think it's going to be difficult for any to be better than this, because this is another one of those 5 books that I cannot stop thinking about. It is in my top 5. The Children of the Alley is unlike any other allegory or book I've experienced in both its ambition and execution. And fortunately, I'm not somebody who is like the beauty of language doesn't really determine my appreciation of a book. I can look past translations. I enjoy looking past translations, because even I think it's even said in one book I have around here, even an original work is a translation of the author's consciousness. And so all books are translations, even in their own language. I believe that's in my foreword to Death in Venice by Thomas Mann, somewhere around here. So, and then the magical thing happened, which was, for the first time in my life, I appreciated poetry. Cesar Vallejo, Poesía Completa, the Black Heralds, or Los Heraldos Negros, is the first work of poetry that I really appreciated. I have a video on it reading some of my favorites. The Eternal Dice, if I had to name a favorite poem, I would say the Eternal Dice at this time, or possibly one by Fernando Pessoa. He's coming up too. So yeah, and then we got the Conference of the Birds, a Sufi work that just was monumental in how much of what I felt human nature it embarks on through this metaphor or allegory of these 30 birds, and these birds and each one making their excuse not to go on the metaphysical journey, to not do it, and the hoopoe having to talk all of them into going. This is another one of my 5 works, my 5 greatest works of all time. So that's 4 of them now, and I will most certainly be talking more about these in the future and spending more time with them, going back and back. I've gone back into them many times already since I've read it. So now this is, I was very surprised to find myself unable to take this out of this list today. I thought there's An African in Greenland by Tete Michel Kamasi, who is from Togo. But it's an ethnography about, an ethnographic memoir about his travels through Greenland. And he really is like the first African to spend, that most of these people have ever seen. And this idea of being completely out of his world, and but it's not just that, it's the slice of life, like just living the life of the Greenlanders. And it's not the romantic way he imagined it. It's not, what, and this is the book that really struck me, that another thing I really love in books is just to appreciate mundane things in life through books. Even when I was younger, some of the books I read as kids, I would read and reread certain parts of books where nothing interesting was happening. Those were some of my favorite parts, because I just wanted to feel like I was living a normal life, and or a certain time around like a festival, or just to feel like that warm feeling when you're with family and there's kind of beautiful festivities going on around you. It's a feeling that I feel has been a very long time since, I've felt it now and then, but it's a rare thing that I feel like literature can just keep kind of bringing back and remind us that like we can also create beauty in this world, and nothing reminds me that we can create beauty in this world more than just finding that beauty in the mundane. And there's other books here that reflect this. I think even Tove Jansson is a really great reflection of that if we go back to very early in this video. But on the darker end of things, Anton de Kam, We Slaves of Suram, I kept here because it fits all 3 of my criteria, except wanting to go back into this world again. But sometimes it's not about wanting, because this is something that really happened. And if we're going to talk about the horrors of slavery, this is a case where I would rather I get the straight facts, but told with passion. And Anton de Kam tells it with passion. It is a history written with passion. And I love it. I love this. I think that this was extremely effective in getting it through to me, getting certain things through to me, that sometimes we do need to be reminded of the evil that people are capable of, and not just people, but the institutions we build, the evil that our institutions are capable of upholding and creating. And it's good to have that reminder of that. I can't just say like, we're just going to look at all the beautiful things in life. That wouldn't feel correct. I don't think I could even do that. So here he is, Fernando Pessoa. The Book of Disquiet I read very early on. It was good. I think I had a great video on it because it's one of the most viewed on this channel. But I didn't really appreciate Fernando Piso, I'm not going to lie. I didn't consider him one of my favorites until I read the poems of Alberto Cairo. So you could almost say Alberto Cairo is one of my favorite poets. And the spiritual materialism, as I call it, I don't know, that's kind of dumb, but that's the best way I can think of what it makes me feel. This sense of, if God wanted us, clearly God does not want us to know God directly. He wants us to know, or she wants us to know them through the material things we see in front of us. Is that, that kind of sentiment is in his poems, and there's a lot of it that just makes me feel so in my body and so much a part of life, never to ask from life what life is not. That is, and it makes me feel okay with it, with just being what I am, with just being. And that is a really powerful thing. Is there anything more powerful than that? I don't know. So, this is an interesting, a few that I was considering pulling out, but Italo Calvino has been an interesting author for me, but nothing has quite stayed with me like 6 Memos for the Next Millennium. Baron in the Trees is a riveting story, an honorable mention, okay? Invisible Cities, very interesting work, an honorable mention, but again, that should almost be here, okay? Let's pretend Invisible Cities is here right alongside this. But 6 Memos for the Next Millennium is the one with all of its references to different literature. It's dense, it's sharp, it gets to the heart of what writing is. This is my favorite book about writing that I have read. And I have in the past read some things, advice, or listened to advice about how to write. This is my favorite piece of work in any medium about how to write. Because it doesn't actually tell you how to write. It's just 5 ideas, kind of 5 themes where Italo Calvino explores what they mean in the context of writing. So it's sort of an indirect, it's more of a philosophy of writing book, I suppose, but while being very it's not anti-philosophical, it's just it's very to the point, right? It's very sharpened. So, unlike yours truly. So we also have In the Company of Men and The Shadow of Imana, Travels in the Heart of Rwanda, both by Veronique Tajo from Ivory Coast. No, she was born in France, but I think her parents were Ivorian or something. I don't know. I can't remember. It doesn't matter. But she has lived throughout Africa. She's traveled throughout and has written, on themes throughout the African continent. The Shadow of Imana is the most harrowing book I've read on the Rwandan genocide, and it is, it comes at it. These are both very short books, but they both come at the themes they discuss, the Rwandan genocide and the Ebola crisis, from so many different approaches in such a short time, in such, dignified. It's not the most amazingly poetic thing you've ever read, but it is poetic, and it's so dignified, and it's so, I'm really amazed at just the coherence and the style of writing, and I think I think her writing exemplifies a lot of what Italo Calvino was kind of trying to get at in 6 Memos for the Next Millennium, and in some of his work as well. But I think Veronique Tajo does it just as, if not more successfully. So really worth reading. And at this point, I came upon thinking different, this was also a time reading 6 Memos for the Next Millennium where I was thinking about different ways of approaching literature, and how are video games different from literature, and how, I also, of course, discussed at one point a tabletop role-playing game book, and how games can be generative literature. This tradition goes back to ancient China, the oldest book written in China, the I Ching. And I remember even the lead translator John Minford calling this a game. And now, I have only done a handful of readings of the I Ching, but it is one of my top 5 books of all time because I always know it's there. It is a book that I can eternally play to gain some kind of insight or wisdom. I like it better than tarot cards. I think the I Ching is just a wonderful book of poetry, wisdom, a wonderful game, whatever you want to call it. It is a unique artifact in itself. No other culture really has something quite comparable to what the I Ching is, and it really is wonderful that the entire world can now experience it through English translations. The entire world can experience it through English translations. That was a bad sentence for many reasons. Let's continue. I'm happy that much of the world can now experience it, okay? So, the Metamorphoses, Ovid, another one of the top, actually I think we have 6 books now. My top 5 is actually 6 books, guys. So this is the other one, Ovid's Metamorphoses. I'm not great at math either, I guess. So the Metamorphoses by Ovid, I called, like, if you were to ask me what's the greatest work of literature ever written, that's the one I would say. I still stand by that, but that's, of course, personal opinion, and I'm not trying to rank things. I just have not come on anything that is so starkly alone in time. Like, if you look just thousands of years on either side of Ovid, there's just really nothing like it. The combination of poetry, iconoclasm, the willingness to just, you know, in a completely artistic and intelligent way to rip through, you know, especially on the fall of the Roman Republic and the beginning of the Roman Empire, to not only use this as like a sort of jab at the powers that be, but also to create something where within it I can find a passage that suits any place that I am in life, whether I want to just read about something that fills me with warmth and love, or read about the worst of humanity. It's all in Ovid's Metamorphoses. I left that book feeling like no part of life escaped it. And that's why I personally think it's the greatest work ever written. But that could always change in the future. And again, like, I don't want to take that to, like, what would it be without everything else, right? I mean, when we talk about the greatest work, even the greatest works of literature wouldn't be great in a vacuum. It's everything around us also contributes, and that's why even just putting together this group of books was so difficult, because it's like these really great books are given meaning by other books that are very good, but maybe just only explore one kind of part of what that great book is doing, and so it's really hard to qualify these things. I don't know. It's just, but I do think this is a great video to work all this out. And so here we are. One video after I said I feel this talk ramble style of video is coming to its end. I am about to create the longest talk ramble video I've ever made. But that now does it for the books that I have read that I consider my favorite books. And now what I want to talk about are the books that I'm currently reading that are already some of my favorite books. And I haven't finished them, but we have the Essays of Montaigne. I picked this up because I had heard of them and thought they sounded like really interesting. Like, I knew there was one about cannibalism, very interesting. So, you know, among other things that are more essential, important, like The Punishment of Cowardice, or Conscience, or the first one, That Men by Various Ways Arrive at the Same End. I'm enjoying just jumping in and reading one of these here and there. You know, it's one of those books that's great at that, and it doesn't even matter if you finish this. They're just essays, and they are the first essays. and I'm coming to really love the essay style. In fact, I just described it recently, but there is like a Venn diagram, I think, of my taste that's being formed here between essays, memoirs, no, essays, journals, poetry, and experimental fiction, something like that. I don't know. But it's like I love books that kind of are in some in-between place in these, or just on their own. But the first essays, and really studying, like, I really love this because as I'm trying to write an essay for Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain, I'm really taking inspiration from Montaigne about what's at the heart of an essay. An essay isn't about getting everything perfectly organized and structured and coming up with some essential truth. It's an attempt to just experiment, to let your feelings flow, to let your thoughts flow, and see what comes out of it. And so I'm trying to take inspiration from Montaigne as kind of like, what is the soul of the essay, and really bring that to my own for the Magic Mountain, and not worrying about whether it's good or not. We're just reading great literature and responding to it. That's all writing is. So, Sei Shonagon, the Pillow Book, is another one that I'm reading right now and absolutely loving. I talked about it in the last video, and again, gotta check out Jorge's video on that. So good. But yeah, it's everything I thought it would be and more. And so, Sei Shonagon, she is now among my favorite authors with the Pillow Book, and I am enjoying reading this now every single night, and will probably be finished with it quite soon. And now, in the final stage, books that I have tried to read several times, but have not been successful. But I keep coming back to them and know that if I keep persisting, they will become one of my favorite books. And one of those is A Dream of Red Mansions. I splurged a little and got these illustrated editions, which are a bit of an older translation. They're also known as The Story of the Stone, another great Chinese classic that's a little bit more recent than the others. I think is it 19th century or 18th? I think it's 19th century, but I'll have to check that. But I've loved what I've began, but it's just like these 3 volumes are pretty intimidating, and I feel like I really have to kind of be dedicated solely to this venture. But what I've read so far has convinced me it's going to be one of my favorite books ever written, possibly even in that top 10, now we're at top 5 to 10 favorite books among those that I have mentioned in this video. So, other books I've started, not finished, The Letters of Vincent van Gogh, but again, I really do plan to return to this one with my newfound kind of understanding that I love, like, and this is what we learned from the Pillow Book and the Letters of Van Gogh, and reading these looks into other people's mundane lives, or parts of novels that help us to appreciate the mundane lives of other people and pay attention to small details. And it's like, this is important. This is important because it reminds us that a human life is important. And we have to feel important. It reminds us that like one life matters. One person being alive matters, and that's what these books that take this kind of this focus on the slice of life, and it's about feeling the meaning of being alive, isn't it? And the effects that we can have on the people around us, and that all of that is important. And really, if you don't believe in that, like, nobody can help you. No, you know, and in some ways I pity really powerful and egotistical and narcissistic people, because they can't see that. They can't see that. It must be a very pitiable existence. I mean, they don't know what they're missing, clearly. Yeah, it's just it's something to think on, kind of connecting again to, like, at a certain point, as long as your needs are taken care of, right? I'm not saying like everybody's comfortable and fine in life, and there's really bad things in life, and it's really tough sometimes, but I just don't think we can ever do without this experience of the mundane through journaling and literature and whatever. And so that's why even though I have great literature favorites here, I never want to think of it too much as essential great literature. I want to think about that they are great because they're bringing me to this point of appreciating the small details of life. Like literature is helping me appreciate life more. Life is the point, right? Life is its own point. Life is the point. That is all I'm trying to say here. And so the Red Book by Carl Jung is another one I've been interested to read, and I think could very potentially be a world that I want to go back into many times, but we'll see. I just know there's so many. I've heard this referenced in concordance with things that I'm very interested in, and so I'm showing this more as a potential. And likewise, Alice Munro's Selected Stories. She's kind of going to be my next attempt to really get into a big, try to read through a short story collection. This is vintage Munro, so it has a lot of stories in it. And again, trying to appreciate that mundane slice of life type of stuff, and all the other stuff is important. Working through the existential fear of Ernesto Sabato or Cormac McCarthy or Moby Dick, or grappling with religion like in Children of the Alley, or some more honorable mentions, Alamut and Samarkand, which I read really recently. I'll call those honorable mentions as well. Working through some tough stuff is great, but I really just come back to the appreciation of the people's lives in front of you, the people around you, is where I'm trying to go. And I don't know how successful I'm actually living that, but I think that's also part of why I'm thinking, okay, I need to disconnect a little bit from this YouTube thing, and at least, or the reading project, and really start diving into these books and really analyze them. But that's only half of it. I also need to live my life. I also need to put into practice whatever wisdom I think I've gained from all of these books. And I don't know if I've been successful. I don't think if there's one thing that's clear, I also have Borges here, which I've read a lot of Borges' stuff and some things that are really interesting, but nothing that really knocked me out. I just felt like Borges has been an influence on so many of these authors that I've mentioned, and also many people who I really respect are really into Borges as well. So I'm certainly not writing him off yet, and I never wrote him off, but I mean, I'm not finished trying to appreciate more of his work, I guess. And so, but he definitely had. I mean, I can't at this time say he's like a great favorite of mine, I guess, compared to some of this other stuff, but. I don't want to end talking about Borges, though. So reading around the world doesn't necessarily mean you're gonna learn all about the world, does it? It doesn't mean you're gonna be this just enlightened being or know all the literature there is to know. It's impossible. And of course, I didn't complete it, but if there's the real important thing is here what. Not the videos I made. I mean, I obviously some of the comments and stuff I get remind me that people are still getting something out of them once in a while. But really the point here is, what do I do with this, right? Who do I become as a result of this? And that's where I look to these books that I've picked out to guide my future reading. And I think even this could be weeded down a lot. I think I've made a point to say which ones are like truly my the top of the top, and there's a lot of them that I kind of just kept them because they were interesting, and I can't really stop thinking about them, and they fit my criteria here, but I don't know. Yeah, what do we do with it? What do we do with this now? And so keep living life, keep reading deeply, and see where things go. Yeah, and I should have said this way sooner, but thank you to those who reached out to me and told me, you should do whatever it is you feel is beneficial on this channel. So if I want to, make relaxed videos where I just talk about things, I should do it. I do feel that like kind of the pace of things has to slow down here. It really has to. And I want to focus a lot more energy on the essays and my own writing and my life, and living the books that I've read. And but of course there's a lot going on in my own life too, so it's just but I appreciate it. Thank you so much for reaching out to say those things, and you know who you are. So with that, thanks again for watching, and we'll see you next time on Mike Reads the World.